History is full of empires, but only one of them came from nowhere. No cities, no ports, no treasury, no written law, no standing army. Just grass and horses and a people called the Mongols, who had built their entire world around both for longer than anyone had bothered to count. Every other empire in history makes a certain kind of sense. A wealthy state expands outward. A powerful army marches from a powerful city. You can trace the logic, follow the money, point to the roads and fleets and institutions that made it possible. The Mongols make no sense at all, until you understand the system underneath them. In the span of a single human lifetime, they swallowed half the known world. Not through overwhelming numbers. Their armies were routinely smaller than the forces they destroyed. Not through savagery alone. Savagery is common in history, and it rarely conquers continents. They won because they had built something the walled, wealthy, garrisoned world had no framework to understand. And by the time that world began to understand it, there was very little of it left. In the year 1200, the world was very old and very sure of itself. Civilizations that had been building for centuries stood at what felt like the peak of everything they had worked toward. Cities of a size no previous generation had seen. Armies trained to levels of sophistication no enemy had yet overcome. Institutions of learning that had accumulated more knowledge than any single mind could hold. The people inside these civilizations had reason to feel permanent. Most of them did. At the center of the Islamic world sat Baghdad. It had been the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate for 4 centuries, and in those 4 centuries, it had grown into something the ancient world had no word for. A city of over 1 million people, its wharves stacked with goods from China, India, and East Africa. Its streets running with scholars, physicians, poets, and merchants from every corner of the known world. The Caliphate's court spoke of it simply as the City of Peace. Everyone else called it the intellectual capital of the planet. The House of Wisdom stood near the Tigris. It was not a single building, but a sprawling complex of libraries, translation rooms, and observatories, where scholars worked in Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Sanskrit simultaneously, translating, arguing, advancing. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy. The works of Aristotle had been lost to Europe for centuries. Baghdad had them, had built on them, and had moved considerably further. While European monasteries preserved fragments of the ancient world, Baghdad was actively extending it. The men who ran this city were not naive about danger. The Abbasid Caliphate had survived internal coups, sectarian conflicts, the slow erosion of its western provinces, and the grinding pressure of Seljuk Turks who had effectively controlled the caliph's government for over a century. It knew what threats looked like. It had a professional army, deep treasury reserves, walls that had stood against every enemy who had ever tried them, and 500 years of institutional memory about how to govern a vast empire. What it did not know was that the category of threat was about to change entirely. East of the Caspian Sea, the Khwarazmian Empire controlled the trade routes of Central Asia with an iron confidence that bordered on contempt for anyone who challenged it. Shah Muhammad II had spent a decade expanding his territory until it stretched from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Afghanistan and northern India. An empire of perhaps 5 million people, fortified cities, and a standing army that was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most powerful military forces in the world. He had recently destroyed the remaining fragments of the old Kara-Kitai Empire to his north. There was nothing left in Central Asia that could threaten him. He was certain of this. To the northeast, the Jin Dynasty governed northern China from its capital at Zhongdu, the city that would one day become Beijing. The Jin were Jurchen people, descendants of steppe warriors who had themselves swept down from the north, destroyed the Liao dynasty, and forced the Song emperors south of the Yangtze River. They understood conquest from the inside. Their standing army numbered 500,000 men, the largest in the world at the time, with a cavalry force of 150,000 mounted soldiers, professionals who had trained for war since boyhood and been equipped from the most sophisticated ironworking industry on Earth. The Song dynasty, pressed south of the Yangtze, was in some ways more remarkable than the empire that had displaced it. By 1200, Hangzhou had grown into the largest city on Earth, perhaps 1.25 million people living in a metropolis that had printing presses, paper money, gunpowder weapons, and a level of urban literacy that no European city would reach for another 3 centuries. The Song had lost the north. In everything else, they were ahead of the world. They had built a navy capable of defeating larger Jin fleets with gunpowder bombs launched from paddle-wheel ships. They were confident their river systems and their technology made them unconquerable. To the northwest, across the steppes and forests of Eastern Europe, Kievan Rus was the largest political entity on the European continent, a loose federation of principalities stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, its cities trading amber, furs, and slaves for silver and silk, its princes connected by marriage to the royal houses of France, Hungary, Sweden, and the Byzantine Empire. Kiev itself held somewhere between 30 and 50,000 people, which made it, by European standards, a major metropolis. Its princes quarreled with each other constantly, as they always had, and that quarreling had weakened the Federation's center. But no outside force had threatened Kievan Rus in any serious way for generations. Why would it? Further west, the kingdoms of Hungary and Poland sat at what they understood to be the edge of the civilized world. Beyond their eastern borders lay the open steppe, the territory of nomadic peoples who had always been a nuisance and had never been more than that. The Cumans, the Pechenegs, the Polovtsi, these steppe peoples had raided, traded, and occasionally allied with settled kingdoms, but none of them had the organization to threaten a walled European city, let alone an entire kingdom. Europe's eastern frontier had held for as long as anyone could remember. The assumption was that it would continue to hold, because it always had. What all of these civilizations shared, beneath their very real differences, was a single structural assumption: that power came from what you had built. Walls, granaries, armies, bureaucracies, treasuries, roads. The more of these you possessed, the safer you were. This assumption had been tested many times over many centuries, and it had always held. The rich survived. The organized endured. The walled city outlasted the man who besieged it. History, as every court scholar in Baghdad and every imperial minister in Zhengdu understood it, ran in favor of complexity, permanence, and accumulated resources. It was a reasonable assumption. It had been correct for a very long time. The problem was that the people about to challenge it had not read the same history, lived by the same logic, or built anything that looked like what these civilizations had built. And that difference, which looked like weakness, was in fact the most dangerous thing in the world. Between the Khangai Mountains to the west and the greater Khingan Range to the east, stretching from the forests of Siberia in the north to the Gobi in the south, lay the Mongolian plateau, roughly the size of Western Europe, almost entirely grassland, swept by winds that could drive the temperature from mild to lethal in the time it took to strike a camp. Nobody built cities here. Nobody built anything that lasted longer than a season needed it to. The people who lived here moved because the land demanded movement. They had been moving and adapting to that movement for longer than any of the civilizations to their south and west had existed. The courts of Baghdad and Zhengdu were aware, in a general way, that nomadic peoples occupied the steppe. They had always been there. They had occasionally been troublesome. The Xiongnu had pressured Han China for generations. The Huns had helped unmake the Western Roman Empire. The Seljuk Turks had once come down from the steppe and remade the entire political structure of the Islamic world. These were known facts, filed under known categories. The steppe produced raiders and opportunists. It occasionally produced conquerors who settled down and became civilized. That was the pattern, and it was a pattern that always resolved the same way. The specific people gathering on the Mongolian plateau in the opening years of the 13th century had no name yet that meant anything to the chancelleries of Baghdad, or the ministries of Zhengdu, or the princely courts of Kiev. They were simply another collection of nomadic tribes, poor, violent, disorganized, irrelevant. The occasional tribute demand from a steppe chieftain landed on imperial desks and was handled at the appropriate administrative level by the appropriate minor official with the appropriate mixture of condescension and irritation. There was no reason to think anything more was required. No one was watching the steppe with any particular attention in the year 1200. Empires had other things to manage. And so the most consequential transformation in the history of the medieval world was completing itself in total obscurity, on a plateau that the most educated, most powerful, most militarily sophisticated states in the world had collectively decided was not worth watching. The Mongolian plateau is roughly the size of Western Europe. Cross it from west to east, and you travel nearly 2,000 miles without ever leaving grassland. In summer, the steppe turns green under a sky so vast it seems to press down on everything beneath it. In winter, the temperature drops to 50 below zero, and the wind comes off the Siberian north with nothing to slow it. There are no forests here to shelter behind, no rivers wide enough to hide behind, no geography that offers any fixed advantage to a defender. The land gives nothing that is not fought for, and it takes back quickly anything left unguarded. The people who had lived on this plateau for 3,000 years had built their entire existence around that fact. They did not farm. The steppe's rainfall was too irregular, its frosts too unpredictable, its growing season too short to support any family that depended on a single harvest. They herded instead, sheep and goats for wool and meat, cattle for milk and hides, camels for carrying loads across the desert margins to the south, and horses, always horses. The horse was not simply a tool on the Mongolian steppe. It was the measure of a family's wealth, the foundation of its mobility, and the instrument of its survival. A boy on the Mongolian steppe climbed onto a horse before he was fully steady on his own feet. He was not taught to ride the way a settled child might be taught a skill. Riding was simply what you did, as natural as walking, as unthinking as breathing. By the time he was 6 or 7, he was helping drive the herd across seasonal pastures. By 12, he could control a horse at full gallop with his knees alone, both hands free for whatever the moment required. The riding that would one day terrify the armored cavalry of Poland and Hungary was not military training. It was just childhood. The seasonal migrations shaped everything. 4 times a year, every family struck its gur, the circular felt tent that was the universal home of the steppe, and moved with its animals to the next pasture. Spring meant the high ground, where the new grass came first. Summer meant following the grazing line north and east. Autumn meant the slow descent toward sheltered valleys. Winter meant finding a place where the animals could reach grass beneath the snow without exhausting themselves. A family that misjudged any of these movements, that arrived too late or stayed too long, could lose its herd in a single bad week. The steppe allowed no margin for miscalculation. The composite bow was the steppe's signature weapon, and it had been refined over centuries into something the outside world had no parallel for. Made from wood, horn, and sinew laminated together under tension, it was short enough to fire from horseback, but powerful enough to drive an arrow through the armor of a heavily armed soldier at 200 meters. A Mongol rider could draw and loose 10 arrows a minute at full gallop. He could fire backward over the hindquarters of his horse, the famous Parthian shot, with accuracy that most foot soldiers could not match standing still. The weapon was an extension of the body, and the body had been shaped by the steppe since birth to wield it. Hunting was not a pastime on the Mongolian plateau. It was logistics. The Great Nurge, the communal hunt in which hundreds or thousands of riders encircled an area of steppe and drove every animal inside it inward to a killing ground, was conducted several times a year, and it was also military drill. The riders had to maintain their cordon over many miles without breaking it. Commanders had to coordinate movement across terrain with no landmarks. Units had to respond to signals without losing cohesion. The same arc that closed around a herd of deer would one day close around the armies of the Khwarazmian Empire and the cavalry of the Polish nobility, and the men executing it would not need to be told how. They had been doing it since they were children. Conflict on the steppe before Genghis Khan was incessant and personal. Clans raided each other for horses, women, and prisoners. A man's position in the world was measured by what he had taken and defended. Alliances formed and dissolved in a single season. The basic social unit was the clan, a group of families tracing descent through a common male ancestor. And the basic fact of clan life was that every neighboring clan was a potential enemy. Blood feuds ran across generations. A wrong done to your grandfather was a wrong done to you, and every man was expected to settle his own accounts. The steppe had no courts, no written law, no institution capable of arbitrating between clans. It had only force, and the memory of force. This perpetual violence was the source of something the outside world found impossible to understand: the absolute centrality of loyalty as a steppe value. In a world where there were no walls, no granaries, no police, no courts, no institutions to fall back on, a man's only security was the men who stood beside him. The trail was not merely immoral on the steppe. It was the one act that destroyed the only thing that kept people alive. The Mongols, who would one day follow Genghis Khan through the passes of the Caucasus and the frozen rivers of Russia, were not following him because they were ordered to. They were following him because loyalty was the architecture of their lives, and he had given them reason to build it around him. The steppe's instability had one recurring consequence that every dynasty to the south had learned to exploit. Tribes defeated in the perennial competition for the best pastures were pushed west, off the Mongolian plateau and into Central Asia, into the lands of Persia and Anatolia, and eventually the edges of Europe. The Huns had come this way. The Seljuk Turks had come this way. Each wave of steppe displacement had reshaped the world to the south and west, depositing new peoples into old lands and forcing the settled civilizations to absorb or destroy them. The Chinese emperors and Persian shahs understood this cycle and had spent centuries trying to manage it, playing tribes against each other, offering tribute to the powerful, encouraging the weak to attack the dangerous. It had worked, more or less, for a very long time. What none of these dynasties had managed to prevent was the possibility that the steppe would, one day, stop fracturing. The violence that kept it divided was also what made it dangerous. Every cycle of displacement produced experienced fighters, hardened by constant warfare, carrying accumulated knowledge of how to fight, how to survive in extreme conditions, how to move fast, and live off almost nothing. The steppe was, in effect, a continuous military training program that never formally enrolled anyone and never stopped running. It graduated a new cohort every generation. Most of those graduates spent their lives fighting each other. The question that no sedentary chancellor had seriously entertained was what would happen if someone found a way to unite them. The Tatars were the most powerful tribe on the eastern steppe in the mid-12th century, and their power rested on a relationship with the Jin Dynasty of northern China that gave them weapons, silver, and political backing in exchange for keeping the other Mongolian tribes too busy fighting each other to threaten the Jin frontier. The Jin paid the Tatars to be a controlled disruption, a managed chaos that kept the steppe divided and manageable. It was a sensible policy. It had worked for decades. It had one structural weakness, which was that the men who suffered most from it, the smaller tribes ground down by Tatar raiding and Jin manipulation, had no reason to accept it permanently, and every reason to produce, eventually, someone willing to end it. The climate of the steppe in the late 12th century had been running cold and dry for a generation. Pastures that had supported large herds were shrinking. Competition for grazing land was intensifying. Raids between clans were growing more frequent and more violent. Not because the people had become more brutal, but because the land had become less forgiving. Families that had maintained themselves through careful seasonal migration found their margins disappearing. The pressure that the steppe had always applied to its inhabitants was tightening, and it was producing the kind of desperation that either destroys people or forces them to find entirely new solutions. Most of the tribes on the Mongolian plateau were being destroyed. One family's youngest son was finding a new solution. The gur left almost no mark on the land. Strike a camp, and within a week the grass had grown back over the fire pit, the hoof prints had softened in the rain, and nothing remained to indicate that anyone had been there. The steppe had no ruins, no old roads, no abandoned walls. Every settlement was temporary by design, and that impermanence was not poverty, it was philosophy. The steppe people understood something that every settled civilization had forgotten in the process of building its cities, that the greatest strategic advantage in the world is the ability to be anywhere and be nothing when you are not there. The Mongol army that would one day materialize out of the horizon outside Baghdad and outside Kiev was not appearing from nowhere. It was appearing from everywhere at once, from a culture that had spent 3,000 years learning how to move. Shamanism ran through steppe life like a current under still water, not organized, not institutionalized, but present in every significant moment. Birth, death, the decision to move camp, the choice of a battleground. The shaman spoke to the sky god Tengri, who was not an abstraction but a living presence above the plateau, visible in the clarity of the air and audible in the wind. Tengri favored the strong and the righteous, and his favor could be read in the outcome of events. A man who won consistently was favored by Tengri. A man who built something large enough was not merely powerful, he was cosmically endorsed. This theology would, in the right hands, become one of the most powerful legitimizing tools any ruler had ever possessed. By the last decade of the 12th century, the Mongolian plateau held perhaps 1 to 2 million people spread across a landscape the size of a continent, divided into tribes that hated each other with the precision and patience that only long memory can sustain. There was no Mongol nation. There was no Mongol language that all tribes shared, no common law, no single god that all acknowledged by the same name. There was only the steppe and the people the steppe had made, people who could ride before they could reason, who could endure cold that killed horses, who had learned loyalty the hard way and violence early, and who were, without knowing it yet, approximately 10 years away from becoming the most dangerous military force the medieval world had ever seen. He was born somewhere near the Onan River in the Khenti Mountains, probably around 1162, into a family that occupied the uneasy middle ground of steppe society. Not destitute, not powerful, balanced on the edge of both. His father, Yesugei, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a man of some local reputation but no great following. His mother, Hoelun, had been taken by Yesugei from another man on her wedding journey, which meant that Temüjin entered the world already entangled in the kind of blood debt that the steppe never forgot. He was named after a Tatar chieftain his father had just defeated. The name was a small trophy. It would become the most feared word in the medieval world. Yesugei arranged his son's betrothal when Temüjin was 9 years old. The girl's name was Bort, from the Olkonud people, and the match was sensible, a useful alliance between two modest clans. Yesugei left his son in Borta's household, as custom required, and turned for home. On the journey back, he stopped at a Tatar camp, accepted their hospitality, and was poisoned before he reached his own ger. He was dead within days. Temüjin, 9 years old and betrothed to a girl he barely knew, was now the nominal head of a family that had just lost the only thing keeping it safe. The clan abandoned them. This was not unusual on the steppe. A leaderless family with young children and dwindling animals was a liability, not an asset. And the other Borjigin families calculated their options and moved on. Hoylun was left with her children, her wits, and whatever food she could pull from the ground. They survived on roots, berries, and small animals. The boys hunted whatever moved. There were seasons when they were close enough to starvation that the difference between surviving and not was a single fortunate morning on the riverbank. Temüjin was 10 years old when he learned that the world owed him nothing, and that the only currency that mattered on the steppe was strength. The years that followed were a tutorial in every kind of hardship the steppe offered. A dispute over hunting spoils with his older half-brother Bektar ended with Temüjin killing him, a violent assertion of dominance within a family that could not afford another fracture. Not long after, the Taichiut clan, which had once been allied with his father, decided that a growing Temüjin represented a future threat and rode into camp to remove it. They captured him, fitted him with a heavy wooden kang around his neck, and put him to work as a prisoner. He escaped with the help of a clansman who hid him in a wool cart, slipped away through the river darkness, and disappeared back into the steppe. He spent the next several years rebuilding from nothing, gathering a small following of loyal men, each one chosen more for his competence and reliability than for his bloodline. Boorchu was the first, a herdsman's son who helped Temüjin recover stolen horses and asked for nothing in return. Jelmi came next, given to Temüjin by his father as a servant, and he remained at Temüjin's side for the rest of his life. These were not noblemen. They were not the sons of chieftains. They were men who had chosen him, and whom he had chosen back. And that mutual choosing was the seed of something entirely new on the Mongolian steppe. An army built on loyalty earned rather than loyalty inherited. He retrieved Borta when he was around 19, riding to her family's camp, completing a betrothal that had been interrupted by his father's death and his own years of near destitution. Her family gave them their blessing and a wedding gift, a black sable coat. Borta was no political decoration. She was shrewd, clear-eyed, and frank in her counsel, and Temüjin listened to her in a way that steppe custom did not require, but that his own instincts recommended. She would advise him for the next 50 years, and the empire that emerged from his campaigns was shaped as much by her political intelligence as by his military genius. The Merkits came for them weeks after the wedding, 300 riders in the pre-dawn dark, seeking revenge for the abduction of Temüjin's mother by his father a generation earlier. The steppe remembered everything. Spoil, and recovered only when Temüjin assembled a coalition large enough to force the issue. Riding to his aid were Togrul, Khan of the Karit tribe who had been his father's sworn brother, and Jamuka, his own childhood Anda, his blood brother. The raid on the Merkit camp was successful. Borta was free, and Temüjin had learned, in the most personal terms possible, exactly what an alliance was worth, and exactly how fragile it could be. Jamuka was the most interesting man on the steppe, and the most dangerous. He and Temüjin had been onda since childhood, an oath of sworn brotherhood that carried more weight on the steppe than blood relation. And for a time after the Merkit campaign, they camped together, shared command, and seemed to be building something jointly. The split, when it came, was not a single argument, but a slow divergence of philosophy made visible. Jamuka believed in the old order, tribal hierarchy, aristocratic privilege, leadership passed through bloodlines. Temüjin believed in something the steppe had never systematically tried, that the best man for a position should hold it, regardless of who his father was. Commoners followed Temüjin in numbers that unsettled every established chieftain on the plateau. The established chieftains noticed. The Battle of Dağın Baljut in 1187 was Jamuka's moment, and he used it. His forces caught Temüjin's army in a disadvantageous position and won decisively. Temüjin retreated, his following reduced, his project set back by years. A different man might have taken the lesson as final. Temüjin took it as a syllabus. He spent the years after the defeat not mourning what he had lost, but analyzing what had failed. His tactics, his alliances, his command structure, the weaknesses in his own operation. The losses taught him things that victories could not. Every subsequent campaign ran differently from the one before it, because the lessons had been absorbed and acted on. He was building, iteration by iteration, a system. The Tatars were the next reckoning. They had killed his father. They were the Jin Dynasty's enforcers on the eastern steppe, well supplied and powerful, and Temüjin had been watching them for 2 decades from a careful distance. In 1202, in alliance with Togrul, he moved against them and destroyed them. What followed the victory was deliberate and cold. He ordered the systematic elimination of the Tatar lineage, ensuring they could never rise against him again. The women and children he distributed among his own people. The Tatars ceased to exist as a tribe. Their warriors became Mongols. Their bloodlines dissolved into his growing nation. It was not simply revenge, it was demographic surgery, performed with the precision of a man who understood that the steppe's greatest danger was a powerful enemy left intact. Togrul turned on him next. The older Khan, alarmed by the scale of what Temüjin was becoming, joined a coalition that included Jamuka and moved against him. Temüjin survived on intelligence and speed. Warned in time, he withdrew to a secret gathering point called the Baljuna, where his remaining followers drank the muddy water of the lake together and swore an oath that none of them ever forgot. The Baljuna covenant was a small ceremony with enormous consequences. The men who drank that water became, in their own understanding, a brotherhood set apart from the rest of the steppe. They were with Temüjin when it could still have gone the other way, and they knew it, and he knew it. He never forgot who had been at Baljuna. He defeated Togrul the following year. The old Khan fled and was killed by a Nayman patrol who did not recognize him. Jamuka survived longer, gathering around him the remnants of every faction that had opposed Temüjin. The Naymans, the Merkits, the old tribal aristocracy that saw in Jamuka their last hope. At the Battle of Chakarmat in 1204, in the Altai Mountains, Temüjin ended it. The Nayman army was destroyed. Jamuka's coalition collapsed. Jamuka himself was captured, not by Temüjin's men, but by his own followers, who brought him in chains hoping to be rewarded. Temüjin had them executed for the betrayal before turning to face the man who had been his blood brother for 30 years. Jamuka asked for a death without bloodshed, which was the steppe's way of honoring a man of rank. Temüjin granted it. Exactly how Jamuka died is not recorded with certainty. Executed without drawing a blade, fulfilling the steppe tradition reserved for those of high birth whose lifeblood was not permitted. Temüjin watched it happen and reportedly wept. Whether the grief was genuine or ceremonial is a question the steppe did not think to answer. What mattered was that Jamuka was dead, and with him the last coherent argument that the old tribal order had a future on the Mongolian plateau. The man who had been Temüjin's greatest rival had, in the end, been his greatest teacher. By 1206, the Merkits were broken, the Tatars were gone, the Naimans were absorbed, the Karait and the Taichiut were finished. Every major tribe on the Mongolian plateau had been either destroyed, incorporated, or brought to submission. Not one of them had managed to combine against him effectively enough or early enough to stop what he was building. The steppe that had been a landscape of perpetual fragmentation for 3,000 years was, for the first time in its history, under a single command. The man who had accomplished this had started with nothing. No land, no army, no treasury, no clan willing to follow a fatherless boy into the grass. He had built all of it from scratch in approximately 30 years, using loyalty as his foundation and merit as his architecture. In the summer of 1206, on the banks of the Onon River, the same river near which he had been born, the chiefs of the unified Mongol tribes gathered in the Great Kurultai. A white standard of 9 yak-tails was raised above the assembly, the ancient symbol of Mongol authority. And the man who had once worn a wooden collar around his neck as a slave received a new name. He was Genghis Khan now, the universal ruler. The title was not a formality. It was a declaration of intent so vast that the men who gave it to him probably did not fully understand what they were promising. He did. The Kurultai that gathered on the banks of the Onon River in the spring of 1206 was not a coronation. Coronations change who sits on top of a system. What Genghis Khan did that summer changed the system itself, root, branch, and every assumption underneath it. Every tribal leader on the Mongolian plateau had fought his way to the top of the same structure that had existed for centuries, a web of clans held together by bloodline, marriage, and the memory of old obligations. Genghis Khan arrived at the Kurultai already knowing that structure was the enemy. A nation built on tribes would fracture along tribal lines the moment it met serious adversity. He had seen it happen. He had survived it happening to him. He was not going to build the same thing again with his name on it. The first and most radical thing he did was take the warriors away from their tribes. Under the old order, a man fought alongside his kinsmen under a commander drawn from his own bloodline, loyal first to his clan and second to whatever larger alliance the clan had temporarily joined. Genghis Khan abolished that entirely. He redistributed every fighting man on the steppe into new units that deliberately cut across tribal lines, mixing men from different clans, different territories, and different old rivalries into squads where the only relationship that mattered was the one forged in shared service. Your brother might be in a unit 2 days' ride to the east. The man sleeping beside you tonight was from a clan your father had raided. It did not matter. You were the same unit now, and you would fight and die as that unit. The structure he imposed was the decimal system, and it was elegant in its severity. 10 men formed an arban, the basic fighting unit, small enough that every man knew every other man's habits, fears, and capabilities. 10 arbans formed a zun of 100. 10 zuns formed a mingan of 1,000, commanded by a mingan-u-noyan, appointed by Genghis Khan himself. 10 mingans formed a tumen of 10,000, the largest standard operational unit in the Mongol army. Its commander, a senior noyan who directed the battle from an elevated position, reading the field and issuing orders by banner and horn signal. The whole structure, from the 10-man squad to the 100,000-man army corps, ran on a single principle. Every unit, at every level, had one commander, and that commander answered to exactly one person above him. The discipline that held this structure together was absolute and deliberately collective. If a man deserted his arban in battle, All 10 men in the unit faced execution. Not just the deserter, but every man who had stood beside him. If a Mingan broke and fled without orders, its commander answered for every death that resulted from the breach. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was an engineering solution to the oldest problem in military history. The moment when individual terror overcomes collective obligation. A Mongol soldier on the battlefield faced two kinds of death. The enemy was in front of him. His own commanders were behind him. The arithmetic was simple, and it produced the most disciplined fighting force the medieval world had ever seen. The meritocracy was just as radical as the structure. Genghis Khan distributed the command of the 95 Mingans, not by birth, but by demonstrated loyalty and ability. Some of the most powerful commands went to men of low birth, former slaves, the sons of herdsmen, men whose only claim to authority was that they had been competent and loyal when it counted. Boorchu, who had helped Temüjin recover stolen horses as a young man and asked for nothing in return, received one of the most senior commands in the new army. Subutai, who had come from a family of blacksmiths, not even a warrior clan, would become, in time, the greatest operational commander the Mongols ever produced. The steppe aristocracy watched all of this with undisguised alarm, and their alarm was entirely justified. The Keshig, the imperial guard, was an institution unlike anything else in the medieval world. It was not simply a bodyguard, it was a school. Sons of commanders across the empire were sent to serve in the Keshig, where they lived inside the imperial household, managed the logistics of the court, and were directly observed by Genghis Khan himself. A young man who served in the Keshig and performed well could expect a command of his own when he was released. A man who served poorly went home with diminished prospects, and a Khan who remembered his name for the wrong reasons. The Keshig was simultaneously a hostage system, the sons of potentially rebellious commanders kept close at hand, and a talent pipeline that identified the empire's best young officers before they were old enough to cause trouble. Before the Kurultai, the Mongolian plateau had no writing. The Mongols were an entirely oral culture, laws passed by recitation, agreements sealed by spoken oath, history carried in the memory of elders and the cadences of epic poetry. Genghis Khan understood that an empire could not run on memory alone. 2 years before the Kurultai, when he had defeated the Naiman Confederation in the Altai Mountains, his men had captured a Uyghur scribe named Tata Tonga, the official seal keeper of the Naiman Khan. Genghis Khan did not execute him. He kept him, questioned him about what the seals were for, and immediately grasped the principle. A piece of paper with the right mark on it could carry authority across any distance. He set Tata Tonga to work adapting the Uyghur script to the Mongolian language and teaching it to the sons of Mongol commanders. By 1206, the empire had a written language, and Genghis Khan used it immediately. He appointed his adopted brother, Shigi Kutuku, as the empire's chief judge, and instructed him to record all legal decisions in blue-covered books, the Koke Detter, that would serve as the permanent record of imperial jurisprudence. Every judgment Shigi Kutuku made was written down. Every distribution of spoils, every allocation of people and animals after a campaign, every ruling on a dispute between commanders, all of it recorded, in a script that had not existed on the steppe 15 years earlier. The empire that had no writing in 1190 had a functioning legal archive by 1206. The speed of that transformation was itself a measure of Genghis Khan's understanding of what administration required. The Yasa, the great law code, governed the empire with a consistency that astonished every outside observer who encountered it. It was not a philosophical document, it was a practical one. Theft was punishable by death. Desertion in battle was punishable by death. Lying to a superior was punishable by death. But the Yasa also prohibited the enslavement of Mongols by other Mongols, forbade the old practice of cattle raiding between clans, and established that no man could be judged guilty without either a confession or being caught in the act. Across an empire that would eventually span a continent, the same rules applied in Mongolia as in Persia, in China as in Russia. The law did not bend for tribal origin or for rank. A commander who violated it faced the same consequences as the man he commanded. Religious tolerance was written into the structure of the empire from the beginning, not as idealism, but as policy. The steppe held shamans, Nestorian Christians, Buddhists, and Muslims in close proximity, and Genghis Khan had no interest in the theological disputes that consumed the sedentary world's energy. Every religion was permitted. Every religious leader was exempt from taxation. Every priest, monk, imam, and shaman served the empire's spiritual needs, and in exchange owed the empire their political loyalty and their practical cooperation. It was a policy that would baffle and impress the envoys who later arrived from Europe, where the idea that a ruler might tolerate multiple faiths simultaneously was nearly incomprehensible. For Genghis Khan, it was simple pragmatism. He needed the cooperation of conquered peoples, and persecuting their priests was the fastest way to lose it. The communications infrastructure grew alongside the military structure. The Yam relay system, the network of stations spaced a day's ride apart across the steppe, was already taking shape in the years after 1206, though it would reach its full development under Genghis Khan's successors. Each station held fresh horses, food, and shelter for imperial messengers. A rider arriving at a station could exchange his exhausted mount for a fresh one without breaking stride, hand off his message pouch, and the next rider would be moving before the first had dismounted. The empire that was assembling itself on the banks of the Onan in 1206 was also, simultaneously, building the nervous system it would need to govern what it was about to become. The Mongol army that emerged from the reforms of 1206 was not simply better armed or better motivated than its predecessors. It was structurally different in ways that no contemporary military system could match. A European feudal army was an assembly of contingents, each loyal to its own lord, each with its own equipment standards, each capable of leaving the field if its lord decided the day was lost. A Chinese imperial army was a vast body of infantry supported by cavalry, organized by province and dependent on supply lines that stretched back to fixed depots. The Mongol army was a single organism. Every part of it responded to the same chain of command, operated under the same law, and had been trained since childhood in the same fundamental skills. It could split into 5 independent columns and reunite 1,000 miles away without losing cohesion, because every column was built from the same components and ran on the same logic. Genghis Khan reorganized his personal household with the same precision he applied to the army. The great families of the empire, the commanders of the Mingans and Tumans, the senior administrators, the heads of the major clans that had submitted, all owed their positions to him personally, and all knew that those positions could be redistributed at his discretion. He distributed the great herds, the territories, and the rights to taxation not as permanent inheritances, but as allocations held in trust, revocable if performance faltered. He gave his own family relatively few commands compared to the low-born men he trusted more. His sons received their allocations last and less generously than the loyal commanders who had been with him at Baljuna. His family complained. He did not change his mind. Tengri, the eternal sky god of the steppe, was woven into the political architecture of the new empire with careful deliberation. The shaman Teb Tengri, who had proclaimed Temüjin's divine mandate at the Kurultai and given him the title Genghis Khan, had made the theology explicit. The sky had chosen this man, and the sky's choice superseded every other claim to authority. In practical terms, this meant that every subsequent conquest could be framed not as aggression, but as the fulfillment of a cosmic order, the unification of all peoples under the one ruler whom heaven had designated. It was an imperial ideology of extraordinary utility, and it required no temples, no priesthood, and no sacred texts to propagate. Every victory confirmed it. Every defeated enemy was, by definition, someone who had resisted heaven's will. By the end of 1206, the Mongol Empire had a unified command structure, a written language, a legal code, a talent-based officer corps, a communications network under construction, a divine mandate, and an army of perhaps 100,000 of the most capable cavalry soldiers on earth. Men who had been riding since before they could walk, who had spent their lives in conditions that would have broken most professional soldiers in a week, and who were now organized into a machine of continental ambition. What it did not yet have was a target large enough to absorb what it had become. That problem would resolve itself almost immediately. The Jin Dynasty, across the Gobi to the south, had been collecting tribute from Mongolian chieftains for generations. The new emperor arrived at his throne in 1208 and sent envoys north to collect the usual payment. Genghis Khan listened to the demand, turned to face south, and spat on the ground. Every army in the medieval world used horses. The Jin Dynasty had 150,000 cavalry. The knights of Poland and Hungary trained from boyhood to fight on horseback. The Khwarazmian Empire maintained a mounted force that had subdued Central Asia. The horse was not a Mongol invention, and the men who faced the Mongol army across a battlefield were not strangers to it. What separated the Mongols was not that they had horses. It was what the horse meant to them. Not a weapon added to a man, but a world a man had been born inside and never once left. The Mongolian horse was not an impressive animal by the standards of the sedentary world. Standing between 12 and 14 hands, shorter and stockier than the war horses of Persia or the destriers of European knights, it would have drawn no particular admiration at a foreign stable. It was not fast over short distances in a straight race against larger breeds. What it had instead was everything that mattered on campaign. It could survive on sparse steppe grass that would starve a European horse in a week. It could break through ice to reach forage beneath the snow. It could carry a load disproportionate to its size. A dark-haired horse weighing 250 kilograms could carry 300 kilograms without faltering. It could cover 80 miles in a day across terrain that other horses could not cross at all. And it could do this not for one day, but for many, because it had been shaped by 3,000 years of natural selection on a plateau that killed anything that could not endure. A Mongol warrior rode to war with a string of horses, 3 to 5 for an ordinary trooper, more for officers, sometimes as many as a dozen for the longest campaigns. He rotated through them constantly, never riding any single animal to exhaustion. What this meant in practice was that a Mongol army on the march was not slowed by the limits of its horses' endurance, because the horses were never pushed to those limits. An army that traveled with 1 mount per man could move only as fast as that animal could sustain. An army that traveled with 5 mounts per man could move at a speed that had no comparable precedent in medieval warfare, and sustain it for weeks. The armies they faced moved at foot pace. A medieval army was a mixed force of infantry, cavalry, supply wagons, and siege equipment, all constrained to the speed of the slowest component. A large European or Chinese army might cover 15 to 20 miles on a good day over good roads. The Mongol army, moving light and rotating mounts, could cover 60 to 80 miles in a day when urgency demanded it, and could sustain 40 miles a day for extended periods over terrain that had no roads at all. The arithmetic of this advantage was simple and absolute. A defending commander who learned that a Mongol force had been sighted 2 days' march to the east had, by the next morning, perhaps hours. His messengers could not outride the army coming for him. His reinforcements could not arrive in time. His retreat could not begin early enough. The speed was not a tactical feature. It was a strategic weapon that rendered conventional military planning obsolete before the first arrow was loosed. The mares in the herd were as important as the stallions. A Mongol rider on a long campaign milked his mares several times a day, producing a fermented drink called airag that sustained him through days when there was no other food. In extremity, a rider could draw emergency sustenance directly from his mount in a careful manner that preserved the animal's life while keeping the rider moving. The animal still able to travel, the rider still able to fight. A commander observed that a Mongol soldier could, nourishing himself this way, ride 10 days' march without cooked food and without lighting a fire. The herd around him was not merely transport, it was his supply train, his kitchen, and his reserve sustenance, all of it moving at his speed and living off the land as it went. No other military force in the medieval world had solved the supply problem this way. Every other army was anchored to its provisions. The Mongols carried theirs on 4 legs. The composite bow and the horse existed in a relationship of mutual completion. The bow demanded a platform that was stable, responsive, and fast. The steppe horse provided all 3. The horse demanded a rider whose hands were never occupied with controlling it. The composite bow required both hands free to draw. A Mongol rider controlled his horse with his knees and his weight, his hands occupied with the weapon from the moment of engagement. He could turn in the saddle and fire backward at full gallop, the Parthian shot, with an accuracy that foot archers with fixed positions could not routinely match. The technical precision of this was the product of 30 years of daily practice, on horses that responded to knee signals with the same reliability that a trained dog responds to a voice command. It was not a trick. It was a complete weapon system, assembled over a lifetime. The formation that Mongol cavalry used in battle emerged directly from the Nurge hunting circle that every warrior had practiced since childhood. Light cavalry, 6 of every 10 riders, opened an engagement from a distance, circling the enemy formation and releasing controlled volleys of arrows. They did not charge, they did not close. They moved at oblique angles, presenting an unpredictable target, not uniform. Armor-piercing heads for cavalry, barbed heads to create wounds that could not easily be extracted, whistling heads that shrieked as they flew, designed to unsettle horses and men alike before they arrived. The psychological dimension of the barrage was built into the ammunition itself. The feigned retreat was the move that undid every army that faced the Mongols without prior knowledge of it, and many that faced them even with that knowledge. A Mongol unit would engage, draw the enemy into a response, and then break and flee, convincingly, at speed, in apparent disorder, sometimes scattering gold and silver on the ground behind them to invite pursuit. The defending force, trained since boyhood in the logic that a fleeing enemy was a defeated enemy, gave chase. The formation broke. The cohesion that had kept them dangerous dissolved in the excitement of what looked like victory. At a predetermined point, the retreating riders turned, the hidden flanking units closed from both sides, and the pursuing force found itself surrounded by the same army it had just been chasing. The maneuver had a name, the Tulukma, and it was not improvised in battle. It was rehearsed, coordinated across multiple units, and executed with a precision that required every rider to trust every other rider completely. It worked because the Mongol army had the discipline to perform it, and the horses to sustain it. The feigned retreat could unfold over hours, or over days. At the Chabchial Pass in 1211, during the first campaign against the Jin Dynasty, a Mongol force was unable to crack a heavily fortified position. They withdrew, slowly, over 6 days, appearing to abandon the campaign entirely. The Jin garrison, watching them recede into the distance, concluded that the attack had failed. They left their strong position to pursue. The Mongols turned, the ambush closed, and the bodies, in the account that survived, piled up as far as the eye could see. The pass was taken not by force, but by patience. By a force that could afford to retreat for 6 days because its horses made distance irrelevant, and could afford to wait because its supply needs, carried in the herd, did not expire. Coordination across the battlefield was managed through a system of banner and horn signals that every Mongol soldier knew from training, and through a command structure that gave unit commanders the authority to adapt within the general directive without waiting for orders from above. A two-man commander directed the battle from elevated ground, reading the field and repositioning forces as the situation demanded. Beneath him, Minggan commanders had full authority to execute flanking moves, support adjacent units, or initiate individual feigned retreats, so long as the overall objective was being achieved. The system combined centralized strategic direction with decentralized tactical execution in a way that no contemporary military had formalized. A European feudal commander needed his lord's permission to change his position. A Mongol Minggan commander acted on his own judgment, knowing what the army was trying to accomplish and trusted to find the best path to it. Heavy cavalry made up the remaining 4 riders in every 10. Where the light cavalry opened a battle and sustained it through archery, the heavy cavalry delivered its conclusion. When the light archers had sufficiently disordered an enemy formation, men wounded, horses killed, cohesion broken, commanders unable to see clearly across a field thick with dust and arrow shafts, the heavy cavalry advanced. They moved in silence, accompanied only by the rhythm of the drums, and at the last moment released a collective scream intended to break whatever nerve remained. They carried 12-foot lances, battle axes, and scimitars, and they hit a formation that was already disintegrating. The battle was, at that point, largely over. What followed was pursuit, in which the Mongol horse's speed meant that no retreating force could outrun what was coming behind it. Intelligence was as much a part of the system as the horse itself. Before every major campaign, Mongol agents, merchants, travelers, diplomats, and defectors spent months inside the target territory, mapping roads, identifying garrison strengths, locating food stores, assessing the loyalty of local populations to their rulers, and identifying which commanders were competent and which were not. By the time the Mongol army crossed into enemy territory, its leadership knew more about the operational landscape than most of the enemy's own provincial governors. The speed of the advance was only possible because the army was never riding blind. Every column moved toward known objectives by identified routes, and the unexpected, to the extent it could be eliminated, had been eliminated in advance. The Mongol army did not carry a supply train in any conventional sense. No ox carts loaded with grain followed the columns. No depots were established behind the advance. Each rider carried his rations on his person, dried meat pressed flat and carried under the saddle, hardened curds that could sustain a man for a day, dried blood reconstituted in water when necessary. The herd provided what these carried reserves could not. And as the army moved into enemy territory, it lived off what it found: the granaries of towns that surrendered, the livestock of the countryside, the supply depots of the armies it had just destroyed. The campaign fed itself from the land it was consuming, which meant that the army's operational range was not limited by its own logistics. It was limited, theoretically, by the extent of the inhabited world. In practice, the Mongols were working through that constraint one conquered territory at a time. The steppe horse's relationship with cold was a strategic asset that no sedentary army fully appreciated until it was too late. European armies did not campaign in winter. Chinese imperial armies went into garrison when the passes froze. The Mongol army preferred winter campaigns in certain theaters because frozen rivers became highways, flat, fast surfaces that the steppe horse crossed without difficulty, and that transformed the rivers of Russia and China from defensive barriers into invasion routes. The rivers of Kievan Rus, which its princes had counted as natural defenses, were at their most frozen precisely when the Mongol horses were at their most mobile. Batu Khan's army arrived in the winter of 1237, crossed the frozen Volga, and was inside Russian territory before the princes had finished arguing about whether to respond. The horse gave the Mongol army something that no other military force in the medieval world possessed: the ability to disengage at will. A force that cannot be brought to decisive battle on the enemy's terms cannot be defeated by conventional means. An army that pursues a retreating Mongol force extends itself, loses cohesion, and arrives exhausted at a position chosen by the enemy. An army that refuses to pursue watches the Mongols circle, probe, harass, and control the tempo of engagement until they find the moment they want. There was no posture a defending force could adopt that the Mongol system had not already accounted for. The horse did not merely give the Mongol army speed, it gave the Mongol army choice. And in war, the side with the most choices, used with the most intelligence, wins. An empire is not a conquest. A conquest is a moment. An army crosses a border, a city falls, a ruler submits. An empire is what happens after that moment, every day, across thousands of miles, for decades. It is the grinding administrative work of making a vast territory behave like a single entity, collecting taxes, transmitting orders, responding to crises, managing officials, suppressing rebellion before it spreads, and knowing, at the center, what is happening at the edges, before the edges have a chance to become a problem. Every great empire in history solved this problem or collapsed. Most solved it slowly, imperfectly, at enormous cost. The Mongols built their solution first and built it fast, and it was unlike anything the medieval world had seen. The yam, the erto in Mongolian, meaning simply change of horses, was a continent-spanning network of relay stations strung across the empire at intervals of roughly 20 to 40 miles. Each station was a modest but functional installation. A large central building, corrals for horses, food stores, and a small permanent staff, whose sole purpose was to ensure that any authorized rider arriving at any hour found a fresh mount, a meal, and shelter waiting. The rider exchanged his exhausted horse for a rested one, handed off his message pouch, or continued in person, and was moving again before the horse he had just dismounted had finished drinking. The chain never stopped. The message never waited for a man to rest, because the next man was already there. The speed this system achieved was, by any medieval standard, extraordinary. A message entered at one end of the network and traveled at the pace of a galloping horse sustained across multiple riders. Not the pace of a single horse ridden to exhaustion, but the full speed of the relay, horse after horse, station after station, across the steppe. Couriers covered 200 miles in a day, and in genuine emergencies, more. A letter dispatched from the imperial capital at Karakorum could reach a general campaigning 1,000 miles away in less than a week. The same general could send his reply and have it acknowledged before the month was out. For a medieval world, in which important news typically moved at the speed of a walking horse, or the pace of a ship dependent on wind, this was not merely faster. It was a different relationship with distance entirely. The riders themselves were selected for endurance and reliability. They wore bells on their belts as they rode, the sound carrying ahead to warn the next station of their approach, so that a fresh horse was already being saddled as they arrived. They rode through night as readily as day. They rode through winter storms across the open steppe, through the mountain passes of Central Asia, through the deserts at the empire's southern margins. A message marked urgent by a senior commander or by the Khan himself was treated as sacred cargo. Nothing interrupted its transit, and nothing delayed it. Interfering with a yam rider was treated as a crime against the empire itself, punishable with a severity that made the point clearly and once. The paisa gave the system its authority on the ground. A small tablet of metal, wood for the lowest rank, bronze for mid-level officials, silver for senior men, gold for the highest, engraved with the imperial insignia and the words that left no room for misunderstanding. By the strength of eternal heaven, this is the order of the great Khan. Whoever shows no respect to the bearer shall be guilty. A man carrying a gold paisa arriving at a station, a town, or a provincial official's court could demand horses, food, lodging, and cooperation. He could not be refused without the person refusing him accepting the consequences of defying the Khan directly. The paisa was portable imperial authority, and it worked, because everyone in the empire understood exactly what it meant. Ogedei Khan, who succeeded his father Genghis as Great Khan in 1229, made the yam the centerpiece of his domestic policy. He expanded the network systematically, adding stations, standardizing the distances between them, regularizing the supply of horses, and extending the routes into newly conquered territories as the empire pushed west into Persia and Russia, and south into China. Under Ogedei, the yam reached its full institutional form. Stations were built, not just along the main steppe routes, but along secondary routes connecting provincial capitals to the main lines. The empire's nervous system became, under his attention, a complete network rather than a collection of trunk roads. He reportedly said that, of all his achievements, the yam was the one he was most proud of. A notable statement from a man whose armies had simultaneously conquered Russia and the Middle East. The military utility of the system went beyond carrying orders. The yam carried intelligence, and intelligence for the Mongol command was as important as any weapon. Before every major campaign, information flowed inward along the yam lines. Reports from agents inside target territories, assessments of road conditions and garrison strengths, the movements of enemy forces, the dispositions of local rulers, the locations of food stores and river crossings. A Mongol general riding into enemy territory did not ride blind. He rode with weeks or months of accumulated intelligence, transmitted by the same relay system that would carry his operational orders back to the capital once the campaign began. The yam made Mongol strategic planning something that no contemporary military organization could match: comprehensive, current, and fast. The local populations along the yam routes bore the cost of maintaining it. Villages within reach of a station were obligated to supply horses, fodder, food, and labor as a form of imperial tax. In the steppe heartland, tribes provided livestock and manpower. In the settled territories of China, Persia, and Russia, peasants and urban residents paid in goods and service. It was a burden, and it was not always a light one. A station servicing heavy traffic could consume a village's surplus entirely. But the system was also, for those who participated in it honestly, a connection to the empire's infrastructure. A merchant who carried a paisa could use the stations for shelter and remounts. A local official who maintained his station well earned recognition from the imperial center. The yam was exploitative in the way that all imperial infrastructure is exploitative. It was also, undeniably, the thing that made the empire function. The yam had no equivalent anywhere else in the medieval world. The Byzantine Empire maintained imperial post roads inherited from Rome, but they were slow, intermittent, and confined to the empire's settled territories. The Abbasid Caliphate had courier services, but they operated at the speed of individual horses and were vulnerable to the fragmentation of authority across a vast territory. Medieval European kingdoms communicated by sending mounted messengers who rode a single horse until it tired, changed when they could, and hoped the weather held. A message between the English and French crowns could take 2 weeks in good conditions. The Mongol yam could carry a message from Beijing to Tabriz, 5,000 miles, in approximately 1 month. No land-based communication system anywhere in the world would match that speed until the electric telegraph arrived 600 years later. The political implications of the system's speed were profound and deliberate. A rebellion forming in a distant province could be reported to the capital and a response ordered before the rebellion had time to consolidate. A general who exceeded his authority, one official who was stealing from imperial tax revenues, could be identified, reported, and recalled before the damage became irreparable. The Yam meant that the Khan governed in something approaching real time across a territory that should, by every conventional principle of medieval administration, have been ungovernable. Other empires fragmented because their peripheries had time to develop independent interests before the center could respond. The Yam compressed that time to the point where the periphery almost never had the chance. Diplomacy moved along the Yam as readily as military orders. Envoys from the Pope, from the kings of France and Hungary, from the Sultanate of Delhi, from the Byzantine Emperor, and from the Song Dynasty of southern China, all found themselves carried into the Mongol heartland by the same relay system that carried the empire's armies. They arrived at Karakoram having crossed thousands of miles in weeks, hosted at stations that were, by the accounts of the Europeans among them who had expected to be entering barbarism, organized, supplied, and efficient. The Flemish friar William of Rubruck, sent by Louis IX of France in 1253, left a detailed account of traveling the Yam and arrived at the Mongol court more quickly than any European envoy had crossed that distance before, or would again for centuries. The Yam shaped trade in ways that outlasted the empire itself. Merchants who carried a paisa could travel the full length of the Silk Road under imperial protection, using station supplies, sheltering at station buildings, moving faster than any caravan that had made the same journey under the fractured political landscape of pre-Mongol Central Asia. The trade volume that flowed through the Mongol Empire during the Pax Mongolica, the roughly century-long period of relative stability after the main conquests, was larger than anything the Silk Road had seen since the height of the Tang Dynasty. Silk, spices, porcelain, silver, horses, and, less visibly but more consequentially, ideas, techniques, diseases, and agricultural products moved east and west along routes that the Yam kept open and safe. The Black Death that devastated Europe in the 1340s probably traveled the same Yam routes in the opposite direction. The system survived the death of the empire that built it. When the Mongol Empire fragmented into its successor khanates in the latter half of the 13th century, each khanate maintained its own section of the Yam network, because none of them could govern without it. In Russia, after the eventual dissolution of the Golden Horde, the Russian principalities that emerged from Mongol rule maintained the relay station system under the name Yamskaya Gon, the Yam Courier Service, which became the postal infrastructure of the early Russian state and survived in modified form until the railways arrived in the 19th century. The thing the Mongols had built to govern a conquered people had become, 6 centuries later, the institutional backbone of the state that replaced them. Marco Polo, who traveled through the Mongol Empire in the 1270s and spent 17 years in service at the court of Kublai Khan, described the Yam in terms that made his European readers disbelieve him. Not because his account was inaccurate, but because nothing in European experience provided a framework for what he was describing. He counted more than 10,000 stations across the empire, each with a minimum of several hundred horses in reserve. He described the bells on the riders' belts and the fresh mounts waiting saddled in the corrals. He described messages traveling distances in days that European couriers could not cover in months. His readers assumed he was exaggerating. He was not. He was describing an institution so far beyond anything Europe had built that accurate description sounded like fantasy. An empire of 12 million square miles, spanning the Pacific to Eastern Europe, governing hundreds of millions of people across a dozen languages and a score of climates and cultures, administered from a capital on the Mongolian steppe, this should not have been possible. Every principle of medieval governance said so. Distance was supposed to dissolve authority. The periphery was supposed to drift. Local commanders were supposed to develop independent ambitions. The yam was the single institutional answer to every one of those supposed inevitabilities. It did not make governing the largest empire in history easy. Nothing could have made it easy. But it made it possible. And possibility, when you are the Mongols, has a way of becoming achievement before your enemies have finished deciding whether to worry about you. Before any Mongol army crossed a border, a message arrived. It was always short, and it was always the same. The language changed: Persian, Chinese, Russian, Hungarian, but the proposition did not. Submit, send tribute, accept a Mongol overseer, provide soldiers when called upon, and your city will be spared and your people protected. Resist, and everything you have built will be erased. The message was not a formality. It was the opening move in a system of psychological warfare so precisely designed that, in a significant number of cases, the battle was decided before the first arrow left the first bow. The army that followed the message was the proof of the message. The message was the first weapon. Imagine you are the governor of a city in Khorasan in the winter of 1220. You have heard what happened at Otrar. You have heard what happened at Bukhara, the second largest city in the Islamic world, with walls that had never been breached, reduced to rubble in less than 2 weeks. You have heard what happened at Samarkand, where a garrison of 110,000 men opened the gates rather than face what was coming. Refugees are arriving at your walls with stories that contradict each other in the details and agree completely on the essential point. Now a writer arrives at your gate with a letter. You read it. You look at the walls around you. You think about Bukhara. The Mongols understand something fundamental about decision-making under fear. That a mind calculating odds against an opponent it cannot fully understand will almost always calculate conservatively. The letter gave the governor a way out. It was designed to be taken. The surrender doctrine was not mercy. It was engineering. A city that submitted peacefully was absorbed intact, its population taxed rather than killed, its skilled workers retained in place, its merchants permitted to continue trading under the yam's protection. Its administrative apparatus kept running under Mongol supervision. A city that resisted was destroyed completely, and the destruction was made as visible as possible. Survivors were deliberately released, not from compassion, but because a survivor carrying a first-hand account of what had happened to a city that refused the letter was worth more than any courier the Mongols could send. The news traveled the Silk Road's trade networks, the caravanserais, the diplomatic circuits, and the refugee columns, amplifying with each retelling. By the time the Mongols arrived at the next city, their reputation had been there for weeks. Merv fell in February 1221. It had been one of the great cities of the Islamic world. Libraries stocked with 150,000 books, an observatory where Omar Khayyam had once charted the stars, a population that had made it a center of learning and trade for centuries. Tolui, Genghis Khan's youngest son, arrived with a force of perhaps 7,000 Mongols, augmented by Khwarazmian conscripts. The garrison of Merv numbered 12,000. The city had walls, weapons, supplies, and a numerical advantage among its defenders. Its governor assessed the situation, listened to the stories that had preceded the army, and surrendered. Tolui promised that lives would be spared. Then, as soon as the city was handed over, he ordered its population driven out onto the plain. Each Mongol soldier was assigned several hundred people to kill. It took days. The libraries burned. The observatory's tower collapsed. Merv, which had existed since the 7th century BC, ceased to function as a city. Nishapur followed 6 weeks later. The city had additional motivation to resist. Tokchar, a son-in-law of Genghis Khan, had been killed by an arrow from Nishapur's walls during an earlier engagement, and the news of that death had reached the Mongol command before Tolui arrived. When the city fell after 3 days of siege, Tokchar's widow, Genghis Khan's own daughter, came to preside over what followed. The orders were absolute. Nothing in the city was to be left alive. The population was systematically eliminated. The devastation was total, leaving nothing alive in its wake, and the conquerors left terrifying monuments of their victory behind. The city was dismantled until the ground where it had stood could not be plowed. A handful of scribes were spared, given one specific instruction, and then released. Go north, go south, go east, go west, and tell what you saw. The scribes were not mercy. They were the next letter. Herat, the last significant city in the region, received the news. It surrendered without a fight. The logic was inescapable, and it had been made inescapable deliberately. The Mongols had constructed, through the systematic contrast of Merv and Herat, annihilation against preservation, a binary choice so stark that the rational calculation almost always resolved in their favor. Resistance meant certain destruction. Submission meant survival, taxation, and the resumption of normal life under new management. Most people, when given that choice with sufficient evidence that it was genuine, chose the second option. The Mongols relied on this. Their armies were not large enough to conquer by force alone every city in Central Asia, Persia, China, and Russia. They were large enough to make the alternative to surrender so terrible that surrender became the dominant strategy across an entire civilization. The reputation spread faster than the armies. By the time Batu Khan's forces entered the territory of Kievan Rus in the winter of 1237, the princes of Russia had been hearing accounts of Mongol campaigns for 17 years. They had received envoys from the Cumans describing the destruction of their own people. They had, in theory, more than enough information to understand what was coming and to make a coordinated response. They did not coordinate. Part of the reason was the political fracture of the Russian principalities, the old rivalries between princes that no external threat had ever successfully overcome. But the paralyzing kind. The kind that makes a man feel the outcome is already decided, and resistance merely adds suffering to defeat without changing it. The torch-lighting order illuminates the intentionality behind the Mongols' reputation management. On night marches, when Mongol scouts needed to conceal the true size of a force, or to create the appearance of a larger encircling army than actually existed, each rider lit multiple torches, 3 or more per man, spacing them to suggest a presence far greater than the reality. The light spread across a horizon at dusk, and told the watching garrison everything it feared was true. This was not a tactic born from necessity. It was a tactic born from an understanding that what an enemy believes about your strength is as operationally significant as your actual strength, and that belief can be manufactured from almost nothing, if you understand the psychology of the people you are trying to break. The artisan exemption was the clearest indicator that the destruction was instrumental rather than nihilistic. After every massacre, every sacking, every razed city, the Mongols conducted a careful sorting of the surviving population. Skilled craftsmen, metalworkers, weavers, engineers, physicians, astronomers, potters, manuscript copyists were identified, separated from the general population before the killing began, and sent east to the Mongol heartland, or to wherever the empire had need of their specific skills. A French goldsmith captured during the Hungarian campaign of 1241 was transported across half the known world and eventually found himself constructing an elaborate silver fountain for the court at Karakorum, dispensing wine and fermented mare's milk to the imperial household. The destruction consumed what the empire did not need. What it needed, it kept. The intelligence networks that supplied the psychological warfare operation were as systematic as the armies themselves. Before any campaign, Mongol agents moved through the target territory for months, often years. They posed as merchants along the trade routes, collecting information about garrison strengths, the loyalty of subject populations to their rulers, the location of food stores, the quality of fortifications, the relationships between commanders, and the specific personal histories of the rulers who would have to decide whether to submit or resist. Genghis Khan knew, before he crossed the Sir Darya into Khwarazmian territory in 1219, exactly how Shah Muhammad II had distributed his forces, exactly how poorly those forces trusted their own commander, and exactly which cities would be most psychologically susceptible to the surrender letter. The knowledge was not incidental to the operation. It was the operation's foundation. The Khwarazmian campaign opened not with an army, but with a caravan. Genghis Khan sent 450 merchants into Khwarazmian territory in 1218 with a message of peaceful commercial intent, an explicit overture offering trade and neighborly relations. The governor of Otrar, Inalchuk, accused the merchants of espionage, which they almost certainly were, at least in part, and executed them. Genghis Khan sent a diplomatic envoy to Shah Muhammad II demanding compensation. The Shah had the envoy killed. These were not provocations that the Mongols stumbled into. They were, almost certainly, provocations that the Mongol leadership anticipated and perhaps invited, because a killed envoy was the single most powerful justification for a war of annihilation that any steppe ruler could offer his warriors and his Tengri-mandated moral framework. The Shah handed Genghis Khan exactly the pretext the campaign required. The Mongol psychological operation extended to the management of their own soldiers' morale with equal sophistication. The Tengri theology provided the ideological structure. Every victory was confirmation of divine mandate, and a warrior fighting for a divinely mandated cause was fighting on the right side of history, regardless of the odds. The spoils system provided the material incentive. A portion of every campaign's plunder was distributed to the fighting men, and the distribution was governed by the same meritocratic principles as the command structure. A man who fought well received more. A man who distinguished himself in the assault on a walled city received recognition that translated into permanent status. The army that terrified its enemies was itself a community of men who had strong personal reasons to perform. The political dimension of selective mercy was as carefully calibrated as the violence. Local administrators, tax collectors, and bureaucrats who submitted early and cooperated fully were frequently retained in their positions under Mongol supervision, performing the same functions they had always performed, but now directing revenue to a different capital. Religious leaders who acknowledged Mongol authority were protected and exempted from taxation, which bound them practically to the empire's legitimacy and made them, in most cases, cooperative voices in their communities. The Mongols were not administering a philosophy of destruction. They were administering an empire, and an empire runs better on functioning institutions than on rubble. The moment that concentrated the fear of the entire Islamic world in a single day came in February 1258 in Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliphate had stood for 5 centuries. The Caliph was not merely a political ruler. He was the spiritual successor of the Prophet, the symbolic center of the Sunni Muslim world, a figure whose authority was, in theory, not subject to any earthly power. Hulagu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, arrived outside the walls of Baghdad with a force that included Chinese siege engineers and Georgian cavalry alongside the Mongol corps. He sent the surrender letter. The Caliph refused, reportedly telling Hulagu that every Muslim in the world would rise in his defense. Hulagu waited. No Muslims rose. The walls were breached in 11 days. The Caliph was executed, put to death in a ceremonial manner specifically designed to ensure royal blood would not touch the earth. The city that had been the intellectual capital of the world for 400 years burned for a week. Baghdad did not recover in the lifetimes of anyone who watched it burn. The irrigation canals that had supported agriculture across the Tigris-Euphrates basin for millennia were destroyed or left to silt up, and the agricultural system that had sustained one of the most densely populated regions on Earth collapsed. The House of Wisdom, its books, its instruments, its accumulated centuries of mathematics and astronomy and medicine, went into the river. The water, by one account written in the years following, ran black with ink for days. Whether that detail is precisely true is less important than what it tells you about the magnitude of what was lost and what was intended to be lost. The burning of Baghdad was the psychological operation's final proof. No city was too sacred, no ruler too powerful, no institution too venerable to be exempt. The letter meant exactly what it said. The first walled city stopped them, not because the Mongols lacked courage or numbers, but because the skills that had made them unstoppable on open ground, speed, mobility, the feigned retreat, the encircling arrow barrage, had no purchase against 20 feet of packed earth and stone. A garrison behind walls did not need to give chase. It did not need to maintain formation under arrow fire. It simply needed to stay inside, hold its nerve, and wait for the attackers to exhaust themselves or their supplies. The steppe horse that could outrun every cavalry force in the world was useless in front of a gate that would not open. The Mongols understood the problem the moment they encountered it, and they began solving it immediately. The Jin Dynasty of northern China had been building defensive infrastructure for generations. Their cities were not simply walled. They were engineered systems, with moats, overlapping fields of fire, towers designed to allow defenders to cover adjacent wall sections, and garrisons trained in the specific techniques of fighting from elevation. Zhengdu, the Jin capital, had walls 9 miles in circumference, 900 defensive towers, and a triple moat. The Song dynasty to the south had been developing gunpowder weapons for 3 centuries. By the time the Mongols crossed into Jin territory in 1211, the cities they were entering held military technology so far beyond anything on the steppe that the gap was not tactical. It was civilizational. Genghis Khan's response was institutional rather than improvisational. He did not try to overcome the technological deficit through willpower or numbers. He recruited the engineers who held the knowledge and made them part of the army. Chinese architects, siege specialists, and weapons technicians were captured, offered service in place of death, and incorporated into the Mongol force as functioning units. A Chinese officer named Chang Pa-tu supervised Mongol siege operations as early as 1211. As the army moved through northern China and accumulated expertise, it built an engineering corps that could construct, operate, and transport siege equipment across terrain that would have defeated a conventional supply chain. The knowledge was not borrowed. It was absorbed and then carried west. The first major test of the combined force came at Zhengdu itself. The Jin capital held out through 1213 and into 1214 behind its triple moat and 900 towers, its defenders launching incendiary clay bombs and exploding projectiles from trebuchets built into the wall structure. The Mongols launched assaults with ladders, took casualties from the naphtha bombs poured down from the towers, pulled back, adapted. They destroyed a Jin relief force before it could resupply the city. They settled into a siege that ground the garrison down month by month. When Zhengdu finally fell in May 1215, it was not because the walls had been breached. It was because the defense had simply exhausted itself, starved and abandoned by a Jin court that had already retreated south. The city that had seemed impregnable for years fell to a siege that the Mongols had learned to sustain. The Kizilkum Desert was considered impassable by any large military force. 300 miles of sand and dust between the Aral Sea and Samarkand, with no reliable water sources and no roads. In a region where the Shah of Khwarazm had deployed his forces on the assumption that geography itself would shield his western flank. Genghis Khan crossed it anyway. He moved his army of perhaps 50,000 men through the desert in winter, navigating by the stars, using intelligence from Silk Road merchants about hidden water sources that the Shah's court did not know his agents had collected. He emerged outside Bukhara on the 7th of February, 1220, from a direction the city's garrison had not imagined possible. The Shah's strategy of distributing his forces across individual cities assumed the Mongols would attack along predictable corridors. The Kizilkum crossing made every corridor unpredictable simultaneously. Bukhara fell in 3 days. The garrison attempted a sortie, rode out through the gates to engage the Mongols in open ground, and was destroyed on the riverbank. The city's population surrendered the outer walls. A smaller force held the inner citadel for another 12 days before it too was taken. Genghis Khan rode into the great mosque of Bukhara, the second largest city in the Islamic world, climbed the pulpit, and announced to the assembled population that he was the punishment of God, and that if they had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like him. Whether the speech was theological conviction, psychological theater, or both, is a question the sources do not resolve. What is clear is that Bukhara's fall sent a message through the Khwarazmian Empire faster than any courier the Shah could have dispatched. Samarkand was better fortified than Bukhara and held a larger garrison. It fell in 5 days. The defenders launched a counterattack on the 3rd day that drew a significant portion of the garrison outside the walls. The Mongols feigned retreat, pulled them into open ground, and destroyed them. The Turkic soldiers inside the city, who felt no particular loyalty to the Persian-administered Shah, calculated their odds and surrendered, reportedly telling each other that the Mongols were steppe people like themselves and would spare them. They were wrong. The city opened its gates on the 5th day. The tactical lesson of Samarkand was not about the walls. It was about the garrison's internal fractures, which the Mongol intelligence operation had identified, and the psychological operation had widened, and which collapsed the defense from inside before the siege engines were needed for more than a demonstration. The engineering corps moved west with the army and grew with every campaign. When Genghis Khan invaded the Khwarazmian Empire in 1219, he brought with him 10,000 soldiers whose specialization was siege equipment. Not cavalry, not archers, but men who could build, assemble, and operate the machinery of city destruction. They carried the components of trebuchets on the march and assembled them outside each new target. They directed the construction of approach ramps, the diversion of rivers to flood moats or cut water supplies, the building of counterwalls to prevent sorties, and the placement of the stone-throwing batteries that preceded any assault. The nomadic army that had started the Jin campaign without a single siege engineer now carried a complete siege department, staffed by the best Chinese technicians the empire had been able to recruit or compel. The Mongols learned to use water as a weapon, with the same precision they applied to every other tool. Rivers were diverted to flood defensive works or cut a city's drinking supply. At Urgench, the capital of the Khwarazmian Empire, the Mongols dammed the Amu Darya upstream and then released it, directing water into sections of the city they wanted to clear. At other cities, they simply maintained a blockade until the water supply inside the walls failed. The principle was consistent. Do not send men against a wall that time and engineering can bring down. Every assault cost casualties. Every well-managed siege cost time, which the Mongol army could afford because its horses grazed off the surrounding countryside while the garrison inside slowly starved. The Mongol system of dividing forces during a siege created a problem that no defending city had a clean answer to. When Genghis attacked Samarkand, other columns were simultaneously reducing Otrar to the northeast, moving down the Sir Darya to the west, and sweeping south through the Fergana Valley. A relieving army sent from Samarkand would expose itself on open ground where the Mongol cavalry held every advantage. An army that stayed inside its walls was safe only until its food ran out. The Shah's decision to distribute his forces across individual cities rather than concentrate them for open battle was probably rational given his awareness of Mongol cavalry superiority. But it meant that no single city could be relieved, and each fell in turn while the others watched. The siege of Xianyang was the longest in Mongol history, and the one that came closest to defeating the system's adaptability. The twin cities of Xianyang and Fanqing sat on opposite banks of the Han River in central China, controlling the only practical invasion route into the Song heartland south of the Yangtze. The Song had spent decades fortifying them. Kublai Khan's forces surrounded both cities in 1267 and settled in for a siege that would last 5 years. Song relief forces broke through the blockade twice by river, using fire weapons and armored supply ships. The Mongols built a river chain, then a fleet to enforce it, then a counterfleet when that was insufficient. After 5 years, what broke Xianyang was not a Mongol assault, but a machine. 2 Persian engineers named Ismail and Al-ad-Din, brought from Mosul in Iraq, who built counterweight trebuchets of a design the Chinese had never seen. The Huihui trebuchet, named for the Muslim engineers who introduced it, threw stones weighing up to 90 kilograms with an accuracy and range that the Song's traction trebuchets could not match. The first shots landed inside Fancheng with a thunderous impact that shook the ground and drove stone blocks several feet deep into the earth. Song soldiers who had held their position for 5 years against everything the Mongol army had deployed heard the sound and saw the damage and understood that the calculation had changed. Fancheng fell. Xianyang surrendered shortly after. Its commander offered the governorship of the twin cities under Yuan rule as part of the terms. The Yangtze was now open. The Song dynasty, which had held longer than any other opponent in Mongol history, over 40 years of resistance, collapsed within 6 years of Xianyang's fall. The synthesis of technologies the Mongol Empire achieved through its siege campaigns had no precedent in the medieval world. Chinese gunpowder weapons moved west with the army into Persia and Anatolia. Persian counterweight trebuchets moved east into China. Georgian cavalry fought alongside Mongol horse archers in the Middle East. Khwarazmian conscripts operated siege batteries against cities their own empire had once controlled. The Mongol army was not a national force in any conventional sense. It was a military system that absorbed the best available technology from every culture it encountered, integrated it into a unified command structure, and deployed it in the next campaign. The army that besieged Baghdad in 1258 was more technologically sophisticated than the army that crossed into Khwarezm in 1219, because every campaign had added something. The system learned. The one domain where the Mongol system encountered consistent, costly difficulty was water. Naval warfare, river crossings under fire, and campaigns in heavily forested terrain all constrained the horse and negated the mobility advantage that made every other Mongol tactical approach effective. The failed invasions of Japan in 1274 and again in 1281 were destroyed partly by typhoons, and partly by the simple fact that the Mongol system had no adequate answer for amphibious operations against a defended coastline. The campaign against Vietnam failed twice, defeated by jungle, disease, and a defensive strategy that refused to offer the open field engagement the Mongols needed to deploy their cavalry. These failures were the system's honest limits, and the Mongol command generally recognized them. No third invasion of Japan was ever seriously organized. What the siege campaigns proved, cumulatively, was that the Mongol system's most important feature was not any specific tactic or technology. It was the institutional capacity to identify a gap, find someone who could fill it, recruit or capture that person, and integrate their knowledge into the army before the next campaign. The steppe had produced a military culture with no fixed attachment to any particular method, only an attachment to results. When the ladders failed at Zhongdu, they found engineers. When the traction trebuchets failed at Xianyang, they sent to Mosul for men who knew counterweight mechanics. When the river chains failed to stop Song supply ships, they built a fleet. The army that had crossed out of Mongolia in 1211 with almost no siege capability had become, within 2 generations, the most technologically adaptive military force in the world. In the autumn of 1237, a Mongol army of perhaps 120,000 riders under Batu Khan and the great general Subutai gathered on the steppe east of the Volga River and waited. They were waiting for winter. Every European and Russian commander who thought about the problem of defending against a steppe incursion assumed that winter was his ally, that frozen ground, impassable snow, and brutal cold would do what walls and armies could not, and slow whatever came out of the east until spring brought better conditions for a defense. The Mongols had reached exactly the opposite conclusion. Frozen rivers were highways. Frozen ground was firm beneath a horse's hooves. And an enemy that believed winter would protect him was an enemy that was not yet ready when the crossing came. Batu Khan crossed the Volga in December 1237 on the ice. The principalities of Kiev and Rus were not a unified state. They were a collection of competing territories whose princes shared a dynasty, a religion, and a profound inability to cooperate with each other in the face of any threat that did not immediately endanger their own territory. The princes of Ryazan, whose lands lay first in the path of the Mongol advance, sent to Vladimir and Chernigov for help. Vladimir's prince calculated that Ryazan's problem was not yet his problem. Chernigov sent no soldiers. Ryazan sent its own envoys to the Mongol camp and received the standard letter: submit, provide tribute, provide soldiers, survive. The envoys returned with the answer that the princes of Ryazan intended to fight. After 6 days of siege, Ryazan ceased to exist. The Prince of Vladimir, watching from a safe distance, began to understand that his calculation had been wrong. The Mongol advance through the Russian principalities in the winter of 1237 to 1238 moved at a speed that seemed, to the people in its path, impossible. Kolomna fell. Moscow, then a modest town of no great strategic importance, fell and burned. Vladimir, the capital of the most powerful Russian principality, fell in 3 days. The royal family of Vladimir Suzdal died in the fire that consumed the city's cathedral, where they had taken refuge with the city's priests and prominent citizens. Grand Prince Yuri II had already fled north to gather a new army. He found one on the banks of the Sit River, and the Mongols arrived there before he expected them, encircled the entire force, and left no survivors. The prince died on the riverbank on the 4th of March, 1238. The most powerful military force in northern Russia had ceased to function as an organized body in approximately 10 weeks. The spring thaw saved Novgorod. Batu Khan's columns were within 100 miles of the city, the largest and wealthiest in northern Russia, its timber trade and Baltic connections making it the most commercially important settlement north of Kiev, when the ground began to soften and the roads turned to mud. The steppe horse that had crossed frozen rivers without difficulty could not sustain its speed through the swamps and forests of northern Russia in the spring thaw. Batu turned south. Novgorod's princes, watching from behind walls they had not needed to defend, emerged into a landscape where 14 Russian cities had been razed in a single winter season. They had survived not because they were strong, but because the calendar had intervened on their behalf. They were among the few Russian rulers who understood how narrow that margin had been. The Mongols spent the next 2 years consolidating the steppe to the south and west, the Cumans, the Alans, the Volga Bulgars, before turning back to the Russian principalities in the winter of 1239. Chernigov fell. Pereyaslav fell. In the autumn of 1240, Batu Khan arrived outside Kiev with a force that the Galician Volhynian Chronicle describes as so vast that the noise of horses, wagons, and camels made it impossible to hear a human voice inside the city walls. The siege lasted 9 days. Kiev fell on the 6th of December, 1240. Its population was driven into the streets. Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, the Franciscan friar sent by Pope Innocent IV to the Mongol court 3 years later, passed through what remained of the city and recorded that he could see nothing but skulls and bones across the open ground, and that almost no inhabitants remained. Subutai had been planning the European campaign for years. He had first seen the western steppe in 1221, leading a reconnaissance force of 20,000 riders on a loop through the Caucasus, across the Caspian steppe, and into the southern Russian lands. The first Mongol force ever to reach that territory. Won decisively and withdrawn east, carrying the intelligence he had come to collect. 14 years later, he used that intelligence. The Mongol invasion of 1237 was not an opportunistic raid that happened to succeed. It was the execution of a plan that had been forming for a decade and a half against a set of opponents whose every weakness had been catalogued before the first column crossed the Volga. The 1241 invasion of Central Europe was the most operationally audacious campaign in the history of medieval warfare. Subutai divided his forces into 3 independent armies operating simultaneously across a front of several hundred miles, with no telegraph, no radio, and no communication faster than a horse at full gallop. The northern force under Batu's brother Orda and the princes Baidar and Kadan drove into Poland, burning Lublin, sacking Sandomierz, razing Krakow to the ground on the 24th of March, specifically to prevent Polish forces from moving south to reinforce Hungary, where the main battle was about to be decided. The whole Polish campaign was a feint at national scale, designed to fix an entire kingdom in place, while the real objective was taken 500 miles to the south. At Legnica, on the 9th of April 1241, the European coalition gathered by Duke Henry II of Silesia faced the Mongol northern force. Henry had assembled what was, by European standards, a formidable army: Polish knights, Teutonic knights, Hospitallers, Templars, and German auxiliaries, perhaps 30,000 men in total. He was also waiting for Wenceslaus I of Bohemia, who was a day's march away with a large relief army. The Mongols attacked before Wenceslaus arrived. They opened with archery, drew Henry's cavalry with a feigned retreat, and used a smoke screen, almost certainly a form of incendiary smoke deployed deliberately, to cut the charging knights off from their supporting infantry. The knights rode into the smoke and found the full Mongol force waiting on the other side. Henry tried to retreat and was cut down by pursuing cavalry. The evidence of his ultimate defeat was paraded around the walls of the Legnica castle as a grim trophy. 2 days later, on the 11th of April, the main battle was fought on the banks of the Sejo River in Hungary. King Bela IV had assembled an army of perhaps 100,000 men, the largest in Hungary's history, and numerically superior to Batu Khan's force. He had secured his camp behind a fortified wagon circle on the river's western bank and placed a strong guard on the single bridge across the Sejo. He felt, by the evening of the 10th of April, that his position was defensible. In the pre-dawn darkness, Subutai was already crossing the river 3 miles to the south on a bridge his engineers had constructed through the night, out of sight and out of earshot of the Hungarian camp. At dawn, Batu attacked the bridge directly, using 7 stone-throwing machines to clear the Hungarian crossbowmen from the crossing, while Subutai's force completed its passage to the south. By mid-morning, the Hungarian camp was being struck from 2 directions simultaneously. Bela's commanders organized a counterattack and pushed the Mongols back far enough to create a temporary relief, and at that moment, the Mongols opened a gap in their encirclement. A corridor appeared in the Mongol lines to the west, and the Hungarian army, seeing an escape route, took it. They streamed through the gap by the thousands, retreating toward Pest. The gap had been left deliberately. Subutai had calculated that a force given an avenue of retreat would retreat down it rather than fight to the death. and that a dispersed, fleeing army in open terrain was easier to destroy than a consolidated army in a fixed position. The corridor was the kill zone, and the Hungarians ran into it willingly. In the weeks after Mohi, Hungary ceased to function as an organized state. Bela fled to the Adriatic coast, where he eventually found refuge on an island. Batu Khan's riders spread across the Hungarian plain, the largest and most fertile grassland in Central Europe, almost identical in character to the Pontic steppe. And the devastation they left consumed nearly half of Hungary's inhabited places. The Archbishop of Esztergom wrote to the Pope that there were not enough living to bury the dead. Batu established his headquarters on the Great Plain and settled in for what appeared to be a permanent occupation. The Danube held his westward advance through the autumn of 1241. He crossed it on the ice in the first days of January 1242 and drove into the Holy Roman Empire's eastern territories. Vienna was within reach. The men who would have defended Vienna never had to try. On the 11th of December 1241, Ogedei Khan, Genghis Khan's son and successor as Great Khan, the ruler whose authority made the entire empire a single political entity, died at his court in Mongolia. The news traveled the Yam network westward. Batu Khan received it sometime in the spring of 1242, after his forces had crossed the Danube and were probing the Adriatic coast in pursuit of King Bela. By Mongol law and custom, the death of a great Khan required every senior prince of the empire to return to the capital for the Kurultai that would select a successor. Batu Khan withdrew. The Western campaign ended not because Europe had stopped it, but because a man had died 6,000 miles away, and the rules of succession required his nephew's presence at a meeting in Mongolia. Europe did not understand in 1242 what had saved it. Contemporary chronicles recorded the Mongol withdrawal as a kind of miracle, God's intervention on behalf of Christendom, the prayers of the faithful answered at the last possible moment. Pope Innocent IV convened a council at Lyon in 1245 and sent friars east to investigate what the Mongols were and what they wanted. The letters those friars carried asked whether the Mongols might be persuaded to become Christians and join the European kingdoms in their campaigns against Islam. The Mongol court received these letters with polite amusement and sent back responses that contained, in various diplomatic formulations, the same message. God had given the earth to Genghis Khan and his descendants, and the appropriate response from any European ruler was submission and tribute, not negotiation. The two sides were operating from entirely different assumptions about what the recent military events meant, and neither fully grasped the other's position. Subutai and Batu had been planning a resumption of the Western campaign at the time of Ogedei's death. The winter invasion of Central Europe that they were preparing, intended to push through the Holy Roman Empire to the Atlantic, which Mongol strategic planning had identified as the western boundary of the world, was shelved when the succession crisis began, and it was never revived in the same form. Batu returned to the lower Volga and established his court at Sarai, the capital of what would become the Golden Horde, the Mongol successor state that would govern the Russian principalities for the next 2.5 centuries. The European campaign was over. The consequences of it were not. The Russian princes who had survived the invasion emerged from it as vassals of the Golden Horde, traveling annually to Sarai to receive their patents of authority from Batu's hand. A political relationship that began in invasion persisted as tribute, and tribute persisted for 250 years. The Battle of Legnica was fought on the 9th of April. The Battle of Mohi was fought on the 11th of April. 2 days apart, two separate armies, hundreds of miles apart on the same European continent, executing a single operational plan conceived by a single mind. Neither army knew the outcome of the other's battle until both were already over. The coordination that made this possible, the months of planning, the shared operational logic, the discipline of commanders who executed their assigned roles without direct communication once the campaign began, was not something any European military organization in 1241 could have replicated. Because no European military organization had the command culture, the communication infrastructure, or the training system that made it possible. Europe survived 1241 not because it was strong enough to stop what came for it. It survived because a political event 6,000 miles away stopped what Europe could not. The killing stopped, and something stranger began. Across 12 million square miles of territory, from the Pacific coast of China to the Danube's edge in Central Europe, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the Persian Gulf, a single political authority now governed more of the inhabited world than any empire before it. The roads that had been dangerous for generations were suddenly safe. The trade routes that had been fragmented by the competing ambitions of a dozen states were now maintained by a single power with a financial interest in keeping them open. The Silk Road, which had been a corridor of tolls, bandits, and political obstruction for 2 centuries, became, under Mongol administration, the most efficient overland trade network the world had ever seen. The peace that followed the conquest was not accidental. It was policy. Genghis Khan had understood from the beginning that a steppe empire sustained itself on tribute, and tribute required functioning economies to tax. A city burned to rubble paid nothing. A city trading silk and porcelain and silver generated revenue year after year. The tension between destruction and preservation that runs through every account of the Mongol conquests was, at its root, an economic calculation. The violence that accompanied resistance was real and total. The stability that followed submission was equally real. Under Mongol rule, a merchant carrying a paisa could travel from the workshops of Hangzhou to the markets of Venice, along a route where no local lord could levy unauthorized tolls, no bandit could operate without fear of Mongol retribution, and no competing army blocked the road. For the first time in human history, a single legal and military framework covered the full length of the Eurasian landmass. The volume of trade that moved through the Mongol world during the century of the Pax Mongolica had no precedent in human history. Silk, porcelain, spices, and paper moved west from China. Gold, medical manuscripts, astronomical instruments, and woolen textiles moved east from the Islamic world in Europe. The great caravanserai cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Tabriz, rebuilt from their ruins and grew larger than they had been before the conquest. Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan traveler who crossed the Mongol world in the 1330s, described Sarai on the lower Volga, the capital of the Golden Horde, as one of the most beautiful cities he had seen in his decades of travel. Vast, full of markets, crowded with merchants from a dozen nations, its streets alive with the commerce of a world that had been stitched together by violence and was now, generation by generation, learning to function as a single thing. Ideas moved with the goods. Chinese paper-making techniques reached the Islamic world, and from there, eventually Europe, where they would underpin the printing revolution of the 15th century. Islamic astronomical methods and mathematical notation spread east into China and Mongolia. Muslim physicians in the Mongol court gained access to Chinese pharmacological knowledge. Chinese doctors learned surgical techniques from their Islamic counterparts. Kublai Khan maintained an observatory in his capital, staffed with Muslim astronomers from the Middle East, alongside Chinese and Mongol scholars. The cross-pollination that occurred during the Pax Mongolica had consequences that ran forward for centuries. The Renaissance that transformed European culture in the 14th and 15th centuries drew on a flow of ideas and technologies that the Mongol road had made possible. The Mongols governed their conquered territories with a pragmatism that astonished every outside observer who came expecting barbarians. Local administrative structures were kept in place wherever they existed and functioned adequately. Persian bureaucrats continued to administer Persian provinces under Mongol supervision. Chinese civil servants continued to staff the Yuan dynasty's government offices. Russian Orthodox clergy continued to lead their congregations unmolested, their churches exempt from taxation, their authority over their communities intact. The Mongols had no interest in the beliefs of their subjects, as long as those subjects paid their taxes, obeyed the law, and did not cause trouble. The religious tolerance that Genghis Khan had built into the empire's foundations as pragmatic policy became, during the Pax Mongolica, one of its most distinctive features. Kublai Khan, who completed the conquest of the Song dynasty in 1279 and ruled the eastern half of the empire from his capital at Khanbalik, the city that would one day be called Beijing, was the Pax Mongolica's most ambitious practitioner. He built the most sophisticated administrative state the Mongol Empire ever produced, absorbing the Chinese tradition of centralized bureaucratic governance into a Mongol framework. He rebuilt the Grand Canal to carry grain from the south. He extended the yam network deep into southern China. He patronized Chinese painting, Tibetan Buddhism, and Persian poetry simultaneously, with the genuine curiosity of a man who found every tradition of learning interesting. He received Marco Polo, employed him for 17 years, and listened to his accounts of the Western world with the attentiveness of a ruler who understood that knowledge of distant places was a strategic asset. The fracture lines had been present from the beginning, because Genghis Khan had embedded them in the empire's founding structure. The Mongol custom of dividing territory among a ruler's sons, each son receiving an ulus, a share of the total inheritance, made fragmentation the empire's default trajectory. Genghis Khan had known this. His solution had been to designate a single great Khan who held nominal authority over all the khanates and whose word was, in theory, binding on every branch of the family. In practice, the system worked as long as the great Khan was strong enough to enforce it. When Mongol Khan died in 1259 with no designated successor, two of his brothers, Kublai and Erik Bok, simultaneously convened separate kurultais and elected themselves. The civil war that followed lasted 4 years and ended with Kublai victorious, and the unity of the empire broken beyond repair. The 4 successor khanates that emerged from the fragmentation operated as separate states almost immediately. The Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia and Iraq, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia and the Western Steppe shared a common ancestry and, nominally, a common law. They did not share a common interest. The Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde went to war with each other over the Caucasus pastures within a decade of the split. 2 branches of the same family fighting over the same grazing lands that the steppe had always produced violence over. The Chagatai Khanate's rulers alternated between nomadic traditionalism and sedentary governance, without committing fully to either, producing instability that would eventually attract the attention of Tamerlane and provide the pretext for a new conquest. The empire that had imposed order on the world had imported the steppe's endemic disorder into its own political structure. The tension between nomadic identity and sedentary governance was the empire's deepest structural contradiction, and it sharpened with every generation. The Mongol ruling class that had conquered China was, by Kublai Khan's time, living in palaces, wearing silk, eating from porcelain, and patronizing the arts of the civilizations they had displaced. The warriors of the steppe who had toppled dynasties across 3 continents were becoming, within 3 generations, the kind of sedentary rulers those dynasties had been. Kublai's court in Khanbalik began to look, in its organization and its culture, more like the Song court it had replaced than like the mobile, meritocratic fighting machine that Genghis Khan had assembled on the Onan River. The Mongol commanders who had once been promoted for ability now inherited their positions. The discipline that had made the army the most reliable fighting force in the world began to erode in the comfort of permanent residence. The Golden Horde converted to Islam in the early 14th century. The Ilkhanate had already done so, the Chagatai Khanate moved in the same direction. The Yuan dynasty's ruling class adopted Tibetan Buddhism. The spiritual homogeneity that had never been a feature of Mongol society, the pragmatic tolerance of all religions, was replaced, Khanate by Khanate, with the particular commitments that came from genuine conversion. Mongol rulers who had once treated all faiths as equally useful began to favor their own, and the religious fracture between the Islamic Western Khanates and the Buddhist Eastern Khanate added doctrinal distance to the political distance that already separated them. The empire that had been held together by the Yam, the Yasa, and the authority of a great Khan was now held together by nothing in particular. The Black Death arrived in the Mongol world in the 1340s, moving along the same trade routes that the Pax Mongolica had made so efficient. It is most probable that it originated in the Central Asian steppe, carried by the rodent populations of the grasslands that had always been reservoir hosts of Yersinia pestis. The Yam stations, the caravanserai cities, the densely populated trade corridors that the empire had built and maintained. Every feature of the Mongol communications network became a transmission route. The plague moved west through the Golden Horde's territory, reached the Crimean port of Kaffa by 1346, and was carried by Genoese merchants across the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean. Within 4 years, it had killed perhaps a third of Europe's population. In the Mongol heartlands of Central Asia and Persia, the devastation was comparable or worse. The trade system that had connected the world also connected its diseases. The Red Turban Rebellion began in China in 1351, fed by a population exhausted by Mongol taxation, devastated by flooding along the Yellow River, and decimated by the plague. It was not a single uprising, but a wave of connected revolts that the Yuan dynasty lacked the military coherence to suppress. The army that Kublai Khan had inherited from his grandfather had been the most capable in the world. The army that faced the Red Turbans in the 1350s was a shadow of it. Its commanders chosen for birth rather than ability. Its logistical systems deteriorated, its cavalry no longer the product of lifelong steppe training, but of a settled military culture that had lost the physical foundation of its power. A Buddhist monk named Zhu Yuanzhang, born to a peasant family so poor that several of his siblings had starved to death in a famine, rose through the rebellion's ranks and took Khan Balik in 1368. He became the Hongwu Emperor of the Ming Dynasty. The Mongols retreated north, back to the steppe. What the Ming chose to do with what they inherited is one of the great reversals in the history of geopolitics. The Yongle Emperor, who seized power in 1402 and ruled until 1424, launched the famous voyages of Zheng He, a fleet of treasure ships so large that no European vessel of the era came close to their scale, sailing as far as East Africa and establishing Chinese diplomatic presence across the Indian Ocean. Then his successors stopped them. The Confucian bureaucracy that administered the Ming state regarded the ocean voyages as extravagant, dangerous, and contrary to the empire's proper self-sufficiency. The ships were decommissioned. The records of the voyages were in some cases deliberately destroyed. The world-connecting impulse that the Mongol road had embodied was replaced by walls. The Ming dynasty built and extended the Great Wall on a scale that no previous dynasty had attempted, choosing to define China's security in terms of enclosure rather than projection. The Golden Horde fragmented through the latter half of the 14th century, its unity destroyed by the plague, by the campaigns of Tamerlane, who sacked Sarai, the Golden Horde's capital, in 1395, and shattered its military power beyond recovery, and by the steady political consolidation of the Russian principalities under Moscow's leadership. The Grand Duchy of Moscow, which had begun as one of the smallest and least significant of the Russian principalities under Mongol rule, grew to prominence partly through its role as the Golden Horde's tax collector, a position that gave it administrative authority, financial resources, and political experience that its rivals lacked. In 1480, Ivan III of Moscow refused to pay tribute to the Great Horde and stood his army against theirs on the Ugra River. The Horde withdrew without fighting. 2.5 centuries of Mongol rule over Russia ended not with a battle, but with a standoff, and a withdrawal that neither side seems to have fully anticipated. The Mongol Empire did not fall. It transformed into the Golden Horde, and then into the successor khanates of Kazan, Astrakhan, Crimea, and Siberia, into the Yuan dynasty, and then into a rump Mongol state on the northern steppe that persisted for centuries, into the Ilkhanate, and then into the various Persianate states of the Middle East, into the Chagatai Khanate, and eventually, through Tamerlane's line, into the Timurid Renaissance, and then the Mughal Empire, which governed India for 300 years. The system that Genghis Khan built on the banks of the Onon River in 1206, the decimal organization, the meritocracy, the legal code, the communications infrastructure, the strategic use of terror and mercy as complementary instruments, proved durable enough to outlast the empire itself. The world it made, in which Eurasia was a connected system, rather than a collection of isolated civilizations, did not revert when the Mongols retreated north. The connection persisted. The roads stayed open. The ideas kept moving. What the steppe had built in a single lifetime took centuries to unmake, and in some respects was never unmade at all.